Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for our policy action team's update on and strategizing about our 2022 plans. My name is Wei Tai Kwok, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Policy Action Squad with my counterpart, Matt Bogosian. We meet and we have over 1,200 or 1,400 members across 8 counties in the Bay Area. And we do everything from educational and public speaking, but this group is focused on policy action, specifically policy action at the local level. And so I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Matt Bogosian, to explain what we're doing in policy action and to tee up a little bit of what's happening tonight. Matt?
Great. Thank you, Wei Tai, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being on. I'm Matt Bogosian. I'm a climate reality project leader just like you. I was trained in 2018, and I happen to have background in local, state, and federal environmental policy. I worked at the California EPA and the US EPA in Washington in the Obama administration. When I came back to San Francisco, I was lucky enough to go through the training, and with a lot of other climate leaders in the Bay Area, talked about local governing bodies and how important it is that we have this bottom-up pressure of changing policy at the local level. So within our 1,400 members, we created a policy action leadership team to allow our climate reality project leaders like you that don't have any policy experience, a way to effectuate policy change at the local level. So what we did was we came up with a framework and a strategy and some tools and tactics to create what we call groups of our volunteers and squads. And they come together in little spurts of 90 days at a time to petition a local governing body like a city council or a board of supervisors to adopt a greenhouse gas reducing policy in their jurisdiction by a date certain, like a more aggressive policy than they otherwise would. And of course, it could be on energy, it could be on transportation with electric vehicles, it could be with buildings. And so we did that, and then after a while, we're having some success, and we thought, gosh, there might be some synergies by trying to get our squads, our policy action squads, in these different counties to be working on similar issues. And so recently, we've had great success in the Bay Area, teaming with other environmental groups to petition local governing bodies on new construction, on new building construction, so that they don't have fossil fuels, in those new buildings. And so that's been successful. And so we're looking at empowering our volunteers, folks like you, me, and everyone else, to move out and petition local governing bodies on one of the big nuts out there, which is existing buildings. How are we going to get existing buildings to be fossil fuel free? And so there's a lot of policy action happening around the world on that, in local, state, and federal and national jurisdictions. And so this gathering here is to bring together some experts to talk about how we can do that in the Bay Area and be an example, for the state. And the state, of course, is always an example for the nation and the world on how we're going to pivot on existing buildings so that they're much cleaner. So that's kind of the framework around policy action in our Bay Area chapter of the Climate Reality Project. You don't have to be an expert to be a part of a policy action squad. It's very accessible. You get to know people and learn as you do in these 90-day spurts. So let me leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our experts on this so that we can all go petition our local governing bodies. David?
All right. Well, thanks, Matt, and welcome everyone to tonight's meeting. I'm very excited about this because this subject, particularly focusing on existing buildings and electrifying them, is a challenging subject, and it's a timely subject as more and more jurisdictions have adopted ordinances to electrify new buildings. So it's like, this is sort of the next great lift. And tonight we have really a great panel of 3 expert speakers, and they're going to help us first sort of see the big picture regarding electrification of existing buildings. And then secondly, understand the current state of play around electrifying existing buildings. And then finally, give us some advice, sort of on the ground advice for accomplishing policy action around electrification of existing buildings. And the way we plan to proceed is I'll introduce each of the 3 speakers immediately before they give their presentations. And each of them will be using some slides that they prepared. And then after all 3 presentations are complete, then I'll moderate a question and answer session where you can ask our speakers follow-up questions. And you can do that either via the chat feature or by using the raise hand feature here on Zoom. And for questions in the chat, I plan to read the question aloud before asking one of or more of the panelists to respond. And feel free to ask questions in the chat while the presentations are going on, but understand that I won't be addressing those until all 3 presentations are complete. And my thinking about that is the second and third speaker might answer some questions that the first speaker made you think of. So let's hear all the speakers, and then we'll have 15 or 20 minutes for a question and answer session. So I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker tonight, and that's Jordan Gerow. He's part of the Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization team. He's an energy law specialist with a range of experience in promoting microgrids, distributed energy resources, and utility reform. He graduated magna cum laude from Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University with concentrations in environmental and international law. And he worked for several years with the Pace Energy and Climate Center as a staff attorney. He's appeared before multiple state public utility commissions on questions of microgrids and distributed energy. And he's worked extensively in New York's Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding, focusing on the value of distributed energy resources, and also in the Clean Energy Standard proceeding. Among the Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization team, he takes the lead responsibility for researching outside legal resources for the LPDD site and managing and organizing the database. And if you don't know much about the LPDD site, he's going to talk about that and introduce you. So again, he's going to help us see the big picture. He's going to talk about why focus on methane, a little bit about the differences of new versus existing buildings. And as I say, he'll talk about the LPDD website as a resource that all of us can use. So with that introduction, Jordan, we're interested in hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction, David. I'm gonna try to share screen to pull up my own slides. So let's hope that works. So yeah, my name is Jordan Gerow. I work with LPDD. I'll give you a little bit more background on LPDD just by way of why I'm here. Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization is an organization that really started from a book. In 2019, Michael Gerard at Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and John Dernbach at the Widener University Commonwealth Law School published this Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization text. It's 1,000 pages talking to 58 different expert authors, identifying 35 different pathways that basically took the universe of carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions and divided them up by sector, ranging from carbon pricing to forestry, and generating, in the end, over 1,000 different recommendations for folks at the local level, the state level, the commission level, the agency level, the federal level, everyone for how to tackle climate change. Based on this text, we built lpdd.org. That is meant to be an enormous library documenting all the sorts of resources that you might need to be able to effectuate these kind of recommendations. So model laws, actual laws in other jurisdictions, other legal resources like white papers that get you halfway there, as well as over 50 model laws that our own in-house team has drafted in response to this document. So we're going to talk more specifically tonight about existing buildings, but this is my background, and this is, I think, a resource that you can use on this topic as well as in a lot of other areas of interest for climate reality. So just to give the lay of the land, as David said, depending on who you ask, buildings directly or indirectly emit about 30% of the nation's CO2 emissions, a lot of that coming from electrical consumption. But there are a few important ways to nuance this picture when we try to think about existing building emissions. One is about upstream emissions. So while maybe only 13% of the nation's emissions come from buildings directly, that is actual emissions that you'd see on a heat map rising from the site that would come from fossil fuel heating and cooling. That figure doesn't incorporate all the upstream emissions that make those buildings operation possible. And we're going to talk a little bit more about methane leakage that's involved in producing and delivering natural gas and why that's a concern. Another way to nuance this is talking about embodied carbon. The production of concrete, steel, and aluminum that go into our buildings is estimated responsible for 23% of global emissions. And finally, when we get to electrical consumption, even if we get to that point where we've, as they say, electrified everything, fully electrified buildings still need to focus on efficiency, on distributed renewable energy, storage, smart meters, and other ways to track and manage their consumption. So David asked me to pay a little special attention to the methane issue tonight. And while if you're burning natural gas on site, the dominant pollutant you're releasing is CO2, there's a lot of methane emissions that come out earlier in the process before it is at your home. That are having an enormous impact on climate change. Methane is more than 80 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. We don't know everything about where it's coming from and why it's spiking in our atmosphere, but we know that the primary sources include oil and gas leaks and agriculture, with lesser amounts coming from landfills. Think of rotting organic compounds, think of all the waste food that we produce, and permafrost, actually, as the permafrost begins to melt. Historically, methane's not nearly as well measured and studied as CO2. So just for example, EPA has their own estimate on how much methane is leaking from oil and gas production and delivery. And the Environmental Defense Fund has come along with a rebuttal saying, actually, we think it's 60% higher. So there's still a huge range in trying to answer very basic questions about how much methane we're adding to the atmosphere just through trying to produce things like natural gas. I included this giant graphic at the right to just let the scale of this sink in a little. If you're not fully familiar with methane's role in our climate crisis, this is a graphic from the latest IPCC AR6 report released over this summer. And these things aren't tremendous fun to look at, but if you guide your attention to the right side of the graphic, you'll see that they've broken down the global warming forcing of every different pollutant that we're putting out there. And you'll see on the right-hand bar, you'll see a scale ranging from 2 degrees of warming potential down to -1 degrees at the bottom. And carbon dioxide is obviously leading the way. That's why we talk about decarbonization. But oh my gosh, methane is accounting for a full 0.5 degree. In a world that's warmed maybe 1.1, 1.2, methane is a huge contributor, and we're just starting to understand how huge. That's why if you're following the news out of the latest Conference of the Parties, 100 countries signed a voluntary global methane pledge to reduce levels of methane by at least 30% by the end of the decade. That's why if you're following the regulatory news, EPA has just released a new regulation that will finally target new, modified, and reconstructed oil and natural gas sites, requiring states to reduce emissions from hundreds of thousands of sources for the first time. So all of this sits in the background of how we consider what the stakes are of dealing with new and existing buildings, and existing is the focus tonight. But I want to draw a little bit of a contrast here. New buildings get a lot of attention. They particularly offer regulators a chance to build for the future and get it right from the start with highly efficient designs. Net zero buildings, or net zero ready, which basically refers to buildings that are so efficient that adding a reasonable amount of on-site renewables would cause them to be net zero energy. Incorporating renewable energy and other distributed resources, and designing them to support the electric vehicle fleet that we need. But existing buildings have long lives and slow turnover. So any climate target that we set for 2050 is going to have to incorporate a lot of existing buildings that are still going to be in service, and we need regulatory tools to fight that. So on the new building side, we have a lot of things that are already working for us, and we have a lot of best practices that we highlight at lpdd.org. Each of the bullets here is a whole section of our site that highlights what we think some of the best practices and even model codes, whether that's EV ready building codes, stretch codes, reach codes. We just talked about zero net energy codes. And the push to drive buildings into that territory. Some of the most traditional forms of regulating new construction is just by giving developers bonuses in the zoning code for height and setback and density for incorporating efficiency and renewables. You have a great solar mandate out in California. We're seeing lots of movement on natural gas bans out in California, and the rest of the country is starting to catch up. Another topic that I think bears a little more attention, maybe for a future date, is the embodied emissions that you get from the concrete that goes into your building. So we have a whole section that highlights efforts in low carbon concrete. Started with a great code out in Marin County, and we're starting to see other jurisdictions follow suit. And lastly, green and cool roofs policies. When we get into existing buildings, there's a few different ways that we can try to skin this cat. The traditional ways of regulating existing buildings were mostly to do with energy audits and benchmarking. That is just making people take stock of where their building sat, using peer pressure to try and drive people to make the kinds of investments that made clear economic sense. Or as you'd see mandatory retrofitting when, for example, a building was far enough below the efficiency standard it was designed for. But some of the exciting work is coming piecemeal in the electrification and fuel switching section. We have a lot of resources on electrification and fuel switching that call out how rebates are functioning at the PUC level, at the state level. A lot of incentive-based programs targeting heat pumps. We've called out where legislation has gone through and done that directly, like in Maine, where they decided they're just going to sponsor 100,000 heat pumps, or highlighting where it's happening more piecemeal at the PUC level, at the Public Utility Commission level. ACEEE has a report on our site where they've targeted, or where they've identified $100 million a year going into rebate-style programs. There's some exciting legislation that's been proposed nationally that we are hoping to see more movement on. The Zero Emissions Home Act, for example, takes that rebate concept and pushes it a great deal down the road at the federal level, as well as actually making utilities hit beneficial electrification targets at the regulatory stage, setting beneficial electrification targets that they have to hit as part of their utility building plan. But one of the areas that I want to make sure I mention is actually the first bullet point on this list, are building energy performance standards. And this is really kind of what we see as the bleeding edge. They're being adopted at the city level. You see them in St. Louis and New York, and a little bit at the county and state level. And this is actually for the first time starting to ask that existing buildings hit an increasing efficiency target over time and forcing their owners to invest in the means to do so. And we see, for example, in New York City, they've actually adopted this code so that it's not just general efficiency, but it's greenhouse gas efficiency, so that you can force people effectively, by trying to make their building more efficiently, to invest in the kind of electrification and fuel switching resources that you'd need. So we have a wide library targeting all of these different areas of focus, and we wanted to highlight that for you. I'm going to take a moment and just give you a brief glimpse into the site. This is lpdd.org. You can see we've got 310 different pathways with thousands of resources. And if you were to go through, for example, to what we're talking about in buildings and industry, and go into existing buildings along our pathways, you'd see a lot of very exciting stuff going on right now that that we would hold up as models. Ithaca, for example, just put forward the first plan that we're aware of in the nation to fully decarbonize their building sector by 2030. And they've done it by basically trying to leverage private money through a city-run program to identify all of the different areas where buildings can be made more efficient and switch out traditional fossil fuel powered heat and power, and replace them on a private investment model. So we're very eager to see how that plan works. There's more resources than I can possibly ever get into in our brief little introduction, but I hope I've set the stage a little bit. And with that, I need to turn it back over to David so that we can hear from the next speaker.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jordan. That was really interesting. And I think I had personally been previously introduced to the LPDD resource, but I really hope people are excited about seeing that that's out there, because one of the things that's so hard to find is, what other folks are doing and what are the ideas in this and so on. And that's just a huge, huge resource that's available to all of us. So I really appreciate that, Jordan. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Diane Bailey, and she is the executive director of Menlo Spark. I know that's an organization many of you are aware of because they're very active. They're located in the South Bay, but many of us see lots of climate-related information coming from there. She's a climate and clean air advocate who has a background in environmental science. She worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council for 14 years, working at the local, state, and federal, and even the international level, promoting improved air quality and public health through reduced fossil fuel use, advances in clean transportation, and pollution prevention in industry. Previously, Diane also worked at Citizens for a Better Environment in Chicago and a local transportation planning agency in Houston. She holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Washington University and a master's degree in environmental engineering from Rice University. So Jordan kind of teed up the big picture here. Where Diane is going to take us is to help us understand the current state of play relative to electrification of existing buildings. Like, who is working on this subject? What is the time frame it will play out? What are some of the key issues that are being identified that needed to be addressed? So with that, I'll turn it over to Diane and we'll hear what she has to say.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see. I'm going to do a couple of review slides. Jordan's presentation was so great, so I don't need to get a lot into climate issues that drive the advocacy to reduce methane gas, but just a quick Note about who I am. I'm Diane. I'm with a tiny community climate group called Menlo Spark. And thank you for the generous introduction, David. We work with all sectors, business, community leaders, local government, and even folks around the Bay outside of our focus area, which is Menlo Park. Our original mission was to make the city of Menlo Park climate neutral by 2025. The clock is ticking. We have a couple of years left, but we're still going to try. And we're happy to see lots of cities around us adopting really ambitious climate goals. So this is just a reminder, you know, that poor little Earth sitting there. We're not fine, but we gotta get to work on climate. We had the second worst wildfire year here in California in 2021. Thankfully, we had that crazy atmospheric river to put all the fires out. But you know, and last year, 2020 was the worst wildfire year. So we've seen a 5-fold increase. It's not a fluke. This is something that we're going to be grappling with and could be intensifying if we don't get carbon pollution and methane pollution under control. But fortunately, we have a lot of strategies at our disposal. So I'm going to talk about some of the policies specifically aimed at methane gas, aka natural gas. And this is just a map to show some of the progress. I'm going to talk about existing building policies. And Jordan, thank you for teeing that up so nicely. But this is just to get people excited. Like, we've had so much progress the past few years on policies to curtail gas use in new construction. It really started in July of 2019 in the city of Berkeley when they adopted a gas ban. And that might have come as a surprise to some people, but in actuality, Berkeley has had really strong policies and had been teeing this up for a long time. And I also want to note that there are so many cities working on this and so many groups. I'm not going to be able to acknowledge everyone, but I'll try to acknowledge a few partners along the way. As Berkeley began plotting a gas ban, a number of us looked at kind of a nerdier, wonkier approach to getting gas out of new buildings and had been working with CEC staff and Building Decarb Coalition members to come up with a plan for REACH codes, piggybacking on the state's Title 24 energy efficiency standards. It's sort of the nerdiest way possible to get rid of gas, but it worked. And in March of 2019, a number of us, lots of folks in this picture, and I think, Debbie, it might have been including you, got together in a small conference room at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and we launched the Fossil Free Buildings campaign for Silicon Valley. And since then, we've grown to 37 member groups. You can see some of them here. We're trying to diversify. We cover San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, but we're trying to partner with groups all around the Bay and beyond, and especially including the State Building Decarb Coalition, because they have such amazing resources and staff. And you can see our website there if you want to check out some of our resources. So before I launch into our existing building work, this is just to give you a window into what it was like early on to get some of these policies passed on new construction. At the beginning of 2019, we didn't know if a single city would go for this, you know, before Berkeley, and even after Berkeley, we heard from a lot of local cities, oh, don't talk to us about what Berkeley's doing, they're crazy anyway, which is kind of insulting, but we actually heard that a lot from council members on the dais in Silicon Valley, so fine. So in 2019, we did get over 10 cities adopting these REACH code type policies in new construction, and that set the stage so well for getting into existing buildings. In fact, Menlo Park came along and decided to buck the model codes from the clean energy agencies like PCE, Peninsula Clean Energy. They came up with their own streamlined approach to do an all-electric required REACH code, and that was really a game changer because it shifted the debate from an incentive-based approach to getting rid of methane gas, which sort of hopes for a little bit of goodwill and good judgment, but in actuality hasn't worked that well. And that it shifted that incentive-based approach to a requirement to go all electric and stop using gas in new construction, which at this point seems like a no-brainer. So fortunately, a whole bunch of cities have followed suit. In Silicon Valley, we're up to 25 REACH code type policies. A couple of those are gas bans. Most notably, San Jose is a full-on gas ban. And that is about half of the statewide total, 52 total building codes in California. And that's a really strong platform to work from to get into existing buildings, because now building without gas is sort of the expectation and the mainstream. And it pulled the next version of the state code coming in 2023 to be extremely clean. It's not a full out ban, but it's as close as they could come. Oops. Oh, bear with me. Okay. So getting into next steps with the fossil-free buildings campaign, we are fully focused on existing buildings now. We'll help some cities cross the finish line with their REACH codes. For instance, the city of Santa Clara, which has a lot of new development, millions of square feet in their pipeline. They just did their final REACH code last night. They did the second reading. And so we'll give some assistance to those cities and coordinate and collaborate, but we're fully focused on existing buildings now. And really trying to bring an equity lens to it and ramp up our community outreach, because as we talk to our friends and allies who are green, a lot of them, when we started out this work, were just not aware that methane gas was polluting. They weren't aware that most comes from fracking or that it's a dirty fossil fuel. Okay. And then we're also really focused on financing. What are the cost structures to really make these policies take off and be more palatable? So let me get into some of those policies. Well, first of all, we're partnering a lot with our community energy agencies. So that's like Marin Clean Energy, Peninsula Clean Energy, SVC, and so on. And I want to highlight some of the most innovative programs that are allowing us to really advance electrification in existing buildings. You know, right now we're sort of in this market transformation period where it can be quite expensive for people to electrify existing homes. And sometimes they're getting not the best advice from contractors. Sometimes they have trouble even finding a contractor that can do the work. And so the local community choice energy providers, as well as some of the munis, have really done amazing work trying to advance the field by training contractors. On the equity side, a couple of low-income turnkey programs that are no cost to homeowners have sprung up. Peninsula Clean Energy just launched this past fall, and East Bay Clean Energy is following suit with a commitment. They have a novel approach to work with Block Power, a private company, to help get a lot of homes converted. And then on funding and financing, there's an innovative approach that Sonoma Clean Power started on bill financing. I'm going to get into that in a moment, and just want to know a few more things before I dive into specific policies. On outreach and education, most of the CCEs in the area have gotten on board with the Switches On campaign. This is the Building Decarb Coalition campaign, and it's statewide, but it's being advanced locally by a lot of different players, and that's really helped mainstream the concept of electrification. And then the contractor trainings, as I noted. Okay, so Silicon Valley Clean Energy went ahead and actually adopted an entire building decarbonization joint action plan last year. And they are working to position themselves as a regional leader and sort of convener of all of the CCEs and the players that want to advance electrification. They're having some staff changeover right now, but I think soon they will start playing that regional convener role. So that's exciting. And then in their own territory, they've committed $6 million to electrification. They've advanced their eHub, which is a public assistance tool. And I think they have a lot of exciting policies to come as soon as they kind of get past the staffing changes. Peninsula Clean Energy has advanced this electrification technical assistance program that helps any developer, especially affordable housing developers who need it. And now we're a number of us advocates are pressing PCE to make that tool and that assistance available to just regular homeowners who are trying to retrofit, as well as landlords. And then on existing buildings, they've launched a number of incentives. I think that, you know, as Jordan mentioned, it's sort of a patchwork of incentives out there. I'm not going to go into detail on that. I think their income qualified program is really the noteworthy one that stands out. It's $2.5 million, and they will convert 200 low-income homes. These are care customers. They have community nonprofit partners who are helping recruit the homes, and Since they launched about a month and a half ago, they have, I think, over 50 applicants. So we're pretty excited about this program. It could be a model. Another really important model to help for existing homes to electrify is the on-bill financing. You guys are probably sophisticated enough to be familiar with on-bill financing and know what this is. It's just zero interest loans for electric appliances that you pay back on your power bill. So it kind of streamlines the paperwork, makes it super easy, and kind of takes the bite out of the increased cost, the first cost when you go electric, where you might make that money back over time through reduced utility bills. This on-bill financing program eases that. And I think this is spreading around the Bay. PCE is launching their program in January, and I expect a number of others to follow. And the other novel thing that Sonoma Clean Power is doing to help people convert is that they have an advanced energy center where you can go and you can actually look at different electric appliances and setups. It's sort of like a showroom or a model room, and you can test out and play around with some of these appliances. Right now, I think with COVID, you have to make an appointment, but the center's in Santa Rosa, so I would encourage folks to check that out. And then the incentives, I'm going to skip over this because we don't have a lot of time, but I will note that there are new incentives from Bayron where it used to be that these utility funded programs were, the incentives weren't allowed to be used for electric products. It stems back to the days when electric products were resistant and inefficient compared to now the norm is super efficient heat pumps. And now there's a PUC proceeding actually to prohibit the use of incentive funding for gas, which is great. So the tables are turning. Okay, so all this talk about voluntary things and incentives, that's really nice, but up to date, it hasn't really moved the needle fast enough. We know we need to electrify quickly. We know that we need to prevent new natural gas products or methane gas products from being installed. Furnaces can have a lifetime of 20, 30 years, and we really can't be tied to gas that much longer. And so with all of the funding and financing and technical support, all of those carrots are nice, but we need some mandatory standards in place. And a number of cities are working on these mandatory standards. We've had some headwinds, but I'm going to tell you about a couple of efforts. And I think some of you were there with me on the Zoom for Half Moon Bay last night, so you should feel free to chime in later. I would love to get your perspective. But so 2 cities specifically are working on requirements to prevent new gas appliances in existing buildings, Menlo Park and Half Moon Bay. It's been really tough going, but in Menlo Park, I'll talk about that first. There was a climate action plan adopted a year ago that adopted a zero carbon goal by 2030. And one of the foremost strategies was to electrify everything. Strategy 1 was a 95% conversion of all homes and buildings by 2030. So no one has done that, but now it looks like the city of Ithaca is trying, as Jordan mentioned, so that'll be fascinating to watch. And I just want to know also that there is plenty of legal research out there that shows that the municipal authority is clear, and yet we've hit major roadblocks with public opposition on the cost. So recently, I know this slide is really hard to read, and if we have a minute, I can exit out of this and take you to the spreadsheet. Maybe we're short on time. Okay, I'm going to try to walk you through it. So this slide is showing a new tool from Bayron, the Regional Energy Authority, that offers the incentives. They have this modeling spreadsheet that you can play around with and check a box for different electrification policies to see how fast your city can electrify. So every city in the Bay Area is loaded on here, and you just check, have you done a reach code? Yes. Well, if you can see, that's the little teeny tiny pink line on the top. So reach codes, it's slow going in terms of like how many reductions you get, how fast over time. So the colored graph, by the way, on the right is showing reductions over time and how quickly you can get to zero CO2, starting in 2021 and going to 2045 on the far right. One thing that's really important to note with the reach codes, you see the pink sliver and you think, oh, that doesn't get us far. But in actuality, it prevents a lot of additional emissions. So don't despair on that. The big game changer policies on here that show to be super impactful are requiring electric appliances on upgrade or burnout, and also on renovations. Those are the blue and the yellow color blocks. And then the performance standards, which Jordan talked about, if I took away the replace on burnout, the light blue of the performance standards would be much bigger and more impactful. And then the other thing, you can play around with this tool, and I'll share the URL for it so you can download it. The other thing to note is that if there's a delay in adopting these standards, for instance, if we wait until 2025 or closer to 2030, we just have no chance of making any of those near-term climate goals, because these appliances hang around and have long, useful lives. So I did map out a strategy to get to a 95% electric building conversion by 2030. And really the heart of the strategy is around Reach Code 2.0. And that is this idea that the cities that have the electric reach code, when they go to re-up that reach code, because this every 3 years they expire. So for 2022, the reach code cities will have to re-adopt. If we convince cities next year to adopt replace on burnout alongside the new construction standards, that would be the yellow and the blue bars on the graph. It would have a huge impact. If we miss that 2023 window and we're not successful in getting replace on burnout kind of wedged in with reach codes, we're going to lose a lot of ground. And the end of gas service is another strategy that sort of acts as a backstop. So if we add an end of gas service, and you can play around with different dates, that's sort of a cleanup in case a city adopts a number of strategies and compliance is really low. And then the last policy that I want to note is code compliance. It sounds super boring, but the fact is for replace on burnout, if any replacement to a broken water heater is required to be electric, that relies on people actually getting city permits and following the rules, and most people don't. Compliance is usually around 10%, but the city of Davis has some innovative code compliance requirements that could be copied to make the compliance a heck of a lot better than 10%. So this is the tool. You can download it and play with it. And then I want to, I'm probably running out of time here, but I want to acknowledge that other cities around the Bay are working on electrification policies for existing buildings. San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and probably a handful of others, Palo Alto too. And they're really trying to focus on equity first, to make sure they take care of disadvantaged communities and low-income households. And that means it's going to take a little bit more time, because these cities need to also identify the funding sources to meet the needs of the low-income communities. And in the meantime, they're looking at pilot programs, and I think a couple of cities are looking at performance standards, time of sale, and it remains to be seen, to be honest. So there's not a lot concrete to say here, except that there are workshops coming up in Oakland. So please participate and let them know that time is of the essence. One last really important, I would say, game changer policy that I want to go over is direct install programs. Because we have hit so much resistance in cities like Half Moon Bay and Menlo Park that tried to require electric appliances at the time of replacement. People are just so concerned that they'll have to upgrade their electric panel. Not true, but a subject for future discussion. Or that they'll be hit with a huge bill to electrify. I think we need to start looking at programs to ease the costs, and one really high impact program to lower the cost is direct install programs, where the utility runs the program. A customer can check a box to say, yes, I do want to replace my hot water heater, and the utility provides a couple of choices, has a couple of vendors who are on contract to provide the service, and then that reduces their soft costs like marketing and brings the cost down. So this table on the slide was taken from a SMUD presentation, that's the Muni in Sacramento. And they compared their low-income direct install program. It's been going on a couple of years now. They have over 1,000 installs to draw data from. they compared that with their market rate program. By market rate, I mean that they offer incentives, but the prices are still pretty elevated. So you can see that the cost for the low income direct install is about half the installed cost of the market rate. And if you look at like heat pump water heaters, for example, around $2,000 with a direct install program, and you compare that with the data that PCE and SVC have collected through their rebate programs, they're finding an average cost around $6,000, which is like, whew, that's really expensive for a water heater. And so you could see that there's a huge opportunity for savings here. And also as PCE and East Bay Clean Energy launched their low-income direct install programs, that sort of scaffolding to build out and offer similar programs to the rest of the community, regardless of income. The market version of that would be that customers kind of pay the fair price, but it brings down the overall cost, and it also dramatically, also dramatically reduces the headaches that people have in finding contractors. Okay, I think I'm running out of time here, but I want to cover just a few more policies just to give kind of a full landscape of what's happening on existing building electrification. Some of you are probably getting tons of email from me talking about air district regulations. The Bay Area Air District has 2 proposed NOx standards. These are air quality standards for water heaters and furnaces that take the standard all the way down to 0 emissions. And that's slated for adoption next year and would start to phase in 2027. And the South Coast Air District, that's Los Angeles area, they're in the process of starting workshops and exploring a similar set of 0 NOx emission standards. They may also be adding stoves. So that would be a really helpful addition, especially considering that even though stoves are a small slice of the methane gas use, they have outsized health impacts on people who cook with gas. And then the last thing I'll note is that at the state level, the Air Resources Board has taken notice of what the air districts are doing, and they've proposed their own appliance standards. They're only on heaters and water heaters. And interestingly, there'll be a greenhouse gas emission standards going to 0 by 2030. So that's exciting on the one hand and bold, but 2030 is far too far in the future. This is just a couple of our collaborators on the regional air district work. It's not everyone, but just to give a sense of like all groups, big and small. Rocky Mountain Institute has played a great leadership role in convening folks, and the coalition's always open to other folks joining. And then just note to put all this in context, why is the air district regulating NOx emissions from appliances? Well, it turns out that all of the appliances in our homes taken together on the NOx emissions have a 7 times greater impact on NOx pollution versus all of the gas power plants in California. So this is a huge source and a good opportunity to regulate it for our health and our climate both. And I think Jordan talked about the national effort, so I'll just skate over this just note that this image of Saul Griffith and Bill McKibben and who is that? Art Matusiak of Rewiring America. That was taken from today. They gave a Zoom update on how things are going after post COP26, and it was kind of fun to hear their perspective. No one can say whether Build Back Better will happen or not, the big infrastructure bill, but if it does, it would bring billions and billions of dollars to electrification. So let's cross our fingers and keep supporting Rewiring America. They're pretty much the lead on national electrification. And with that, I'll say thank you. I appreciate your time and attention, and want to close by saying that no one's trying to say that phasing out fossil fuels from our homes and buildings is easy, but we know we need to get it done and get it done quickly. And we know that it's going to take a lot of people working together, and that we really need to make every effort to focus on equity and climate justice. And thanks again.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Diane. I think that we identified your part of the program. Instead of state of play, it was more like drinking from the fire hose. That was just a huge amount of information that I think we'll all greatly value as we try and get our arms around this issue of electrification of existing buildings. So thanks again for bringing that all together in one place. Our third speaker tonight is Debbie Mytels, and she is the co-chair of Fossil-Free Buildings for Silicon Valley, which Diane mentioned, and is a trained climate reality leader. She retired from her position as Associate Director of Actera, a nonprofit environmental education organization based in Palo Alto, and she is devoting most of her time now to community education and action about climate change. Debbie earned a BA with honors in social psychology at UC Berkeley and studied journalism at Stanford. I'm sure she'll be very interested in the big game this weekend. She lives in Palo Alto with her husband, Thomas Atwood, and his 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. And she says that they are the reason she's so concerned about reducing the threat of climate change. So Debbie is going to kind of wrap up our speakers panel tonight. We've gone over the big picture, the state of play. Debbie's going to focus on giving us some on-the-ground advice for climate activists like all of us, and especially how to address the key issues that Diane identified, how to build community and jurisdictional support, and how to get policy action done. So with that, Debbie, take it away.
Okay, thank you, David. Appreciate it. Just a little clarification. I'm not the co-chair of the Fossil-Free Buildings. I'm only the co-chair of the Outreach Committee of Fossil-Free Buildings, which Diane heads so ably. And it's really great to have an opportunity to work with Diane on a regular basis.
All right.
So I'll take the next slide from this one. And basically what I want to do tonight is just talk a little bit about, what should we work on and how to do it. We've heard some ideas on that already, and particularly to spend more attention on building local government and community support, and then how to accomplish some of the policy goals and more specifics to get onto some of those. So what to do? We heard really already from Jordan some of the ideas about working on the big things, but I wanted to just highlight for you a new book that came out just recently by John Doerr, the well-known venture capitalist who, pulled together folks to fund Intel and a lot of other Silicon Valley giants. His new book is called Speed and Scale, and it's really important you keep this in mind. His message was go for the gigatons. And we can identify those as the 4 areas of electricity supply. And I think with our community choice energy programs around the Bay Area and in places like Southern California as well, a lot of the parts of that area, we already can check off done. We've really moved a lot of California's energy supply to being green and clean. And it's really exciting to see what's happened with the community choice clean energy programs. Transportation is another big section that we need to work on, but there's a lot of really good work happening, especially at the federal level on that with the bills that have been pushed through in Washington, and also the announcements by major automakers like Ford and General Motors that they're going to electrify their car system and provide a variety of electric cars, trucks, buses, and everything. So those are kind of done. And I think that the attention of the policy action team now to work on buildings, and particularly the millions of existing buildings in our country, is really the hardest nut to crack. The other ones, I think we're on the path and moving there. The other 2, which are more challenging, of course, and Jordan mentioned this, is cement and steel. And I'll just share with you a little bit that in California, we actually now have the lead in addressing carbon emissions from cement. Senator Josh Becker, who's our representative from Silicon Valley, passed SB 596 this year and signed by Governor Newsom in September. It now requires that California be net zero in carbon emissions from the cement no later than 2045. So that's a far out date, but they're putting it out there as a starter. And it's kind of exciting that California is in the forefront on this. You'll note that among the things to work on is not land use or plastics. It's pointed out in the book by John Doerr, Speed and Scale, that plastics is really only about 2 to 3% of the emissions. It creates a lot of pollution all around the place and is a terrible pollutant for our wildlife and the oceans, but it's not really so greenhouse gas intense. So people will want to spend time on plastics. If you think about trying to hit on the most important things to work on, it's the other 4 things that are up there are much more important in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's just a point to keep in mind. A lot of us who are community-based volunteers really can't do much about the industrial processes because we don't have anything to say about those companies, but the buildings is something we all can work on. So I think that's a really good place for groups like the Climate Reality Project to address. So when we think about what are some of the methods that we can use to work with people to build community support, a key piece of information really goes back to Everett Rogers, the professor of communication, and his work in the diffusion of innovation. Many people are familiar with his work, business school classic at this point. How do people adopt new products, new processes? And you start out with the innovators who've invented a new product or process, and then early adopters start to use it. And before long, if it's a good product, if it works really well for people, you get the early adopters. And then if it's something of value to the society, it's going to go. It's considered to be, it's going to move over and become adopted by everybody. There's a few laggards who may still be using dial-up telephones, but I don't think any of us know anyone. So the point being that we need to think about, we don't really need to convince everybody to change, but we do need to get things moved into the innovation diffusion spectrum and get things moved into the early adopters. And there's some information about that through the Yale Project on Climate Communications, which has been studying American attitudes and behaviors about climate change for about 15 years now. And they have been noticing the increase in the number of people who are what they consider alarmed. That's probably most of us on this call today, who are paying attention, quite concerned about this problem and doing something about it. And already we are now the largest number that they've identified already, and about a quarter of the population fit into this alarmed group, which is wonderful. But we're not enough. We need to move into catching up with and getting activated the next two groups, which are called concerned and cautious. Together, they make up 48% of the American population. And so together we could all be, 3/4 of the population. So we need to really work on reaching those people who are concerned, but they're not really doing anything yet, and find out how to get them to become early adopters and then early majority. And don't worry about trying to convince the people who are deniers. It's not worth our time and effort at this point. Just let them go ahead and bark all they want to, but we don't want to worry about them. So we want to be able to build support. And I think focusing on local government is a really strong place to do that. We've seen all the, difficulty of getting bills passed through Washington, D.C. And we thought maybe we're going to have better luck with it this year, but we're still not even able to pass the Build Back Better bill. But politics is about power, and its political power is about influential voters. And the way that people can be influential voters is they can deliver the votes. They can either deliver them with campaign funds that can be used to influence other voters, or with their own personal people power, ability to attract other people to support a candidate. And that means people who get out the vote by walking precincts, by having parties for their friends. All this is political power. And if you want to think about setting up a campaign in your community, you want to find out who are the people who supported the existing city council members. The city council members are important, but go back and try to find through public records who donated the most to their campaigns. Who are the people that are supporting them? And those people, you want to get them on your side too, because they're going to influence the politicians. Another thing that's important when you think about working with local government is to build relationships with politicians. For a number of years, I was involved with a leadership training program, and we were lucky to have our state senator, Joe Simidian, come and give a talk called his 13 Tips for Advocates. And he had a bunch of wonderful anecdotes that he would share about, sitting up on the city council chair when he was a council member, and somebody would come up and harangue the city council about, you guys don't do anything. You're just taking money from developers and you're no good. And he said, he would say, well, he wasn't taking money from developers, and he knew he had been attending meetings 4 nights that week. He was working pretty hard on the people's business. And most council members are, of course. So you want to have a relationship with those people and understand what motivates them. What are the things that make things important for them? And to go and just harangue them and say, you're not doing a good job is not going to get you very far. Of course, we all understand that in terms of good human relations. And it's really important to think about council members are people too. What does motivate them? How can we make them feel that it's easy to solve the problems by giving them solutions and not just bringing them problems? We're all aware of the problems of climate change. What can we do to start to solve it in our community? And how can we show politicians that by solving it, they will become more popular and be more likely to be voted in? So there are also challenges to keep in mind. The other part of building support is to think about growing your activist base. I once was part of a committee, I will just not mention the name of the organization, but it was a well-known national environmental organization. And they really said, you know, we might have 20,000 members in our county, but we really don't care about them. We just want them to become members. And we want a hardcore of, you know, maybe 20 or 25 hardcore activists who really know what's going on. Well, that isn't, I don't think, a good strategy. What we want to do is we want to build an activist base, get more people involved, because everyone who makes a change becomes a role model to the others who are involved. And as leaders, what we need to think about are the basic leadership skills, which have been so well put together in the book by Kouzes and Posner, two professors who wrote The Leadership Challenge. Again, it's a business school classic, really worth reading. The kind of skills that we need to cultivate in ourselves, among ourselves as leaders, include these 5 points that they identified: putting out some alternatives to the status quo. For example, when we talk about water heaters, what information do people need to do that? How can we find out about who has a water heater that might be ready to fail? What can we do to think deeply into some of these problems? There's a geographical information service group in the country that's working, and they've been finding housing developments that were all done at the same time. So these were housing developments that were built 10 years ago. Oh, well, water heaters are very likely to fail after 10 to 12, 15 years. That would be a prime neighborhood to go to them and say, hey, we have a program for you where you can, all of your neighbors and you can get a brand new water heater that's a heat pump water heater, more efficient. We'll charge you for paying it back on bill financing. We'll give you the installation done by our trained people. You don't have to hunt for different contractors. So it's a whole idea, a new way of looking at how do you install water heaters instead of letting everybody wait till their water heater falls apart. But that's just an alternative to the status quo method. And if you do some brainstorming and try to think about new ways to solve these problems with your team of volunteers, you'll get some really good ideas. And that program, for example, was done in Boulder, Colorado. And I imagine it's listed in Jordan's book of Jordan's database of different kinds of programs and policies. Be sure that you work on inspiring a clear vision, create a focus. We've had an opportunity to have a Stanford class do some market research for building electrification or electrification in general. And they decided they wanted to work on transportation, which is fine. There's a lot of issues to be done on transportation. But we have a 350 Silicon Valley Palo Alto team that's decided to work on electrification of buildings, as has your policy action team. So we decided, well, it's great these Stanford's kids are going to work on that. And we met with a couple of them to learn about what they're doing. But we're not going to jump in and start working with them because we're working on buildings. And we're trying to create a clear focus and inspire people to work on this particular action. So think about that while you're moving ahead with your projects and your squads, and figure out ways to stay focused on the topic you're working on. And then when you come to the stopping point, then you can reevaluate and think, then what next? But having that clear vision that you can inspire people with is so important. Model the way, obviously, if we're talking about putting in new water heaters, we probably should think about how old is our water heater? Is it time to change it? Can we start to use an induction cooktop? What about getting rid of that old furnace? Being involved ourselves in learning as we go. Enabling others includes obviously delegating responsibility. We have a wonderful intern that Diane is also working with the fossil-free buildings in Menlo Spark. And she's a Berkeley student and she's about to graduate. Somebody's going to catch her and take her away from us, I'm sure. But she decided she wanted to do a farmer's market tabling this summer. And we said, oh, okay. And before we knew it, she had the whole thing all set up. She had posters, she had flyers to distribute, she had started to recruit volunteers to get them to be there. She took over the whole thing. And it was like, we just delegated responsibility. Nobody needed to tell her what to do because she had this idea and she ran with it, which is wonderful. So if you find a volunteer like that, let them run, don't micromanage. The last leadership practice that's so important is to really celebrate your successes. I think a lot of us are feeling pretty little discouraged about what happened at the COP22, that we had high hopes that something really would happen. And so it's sort of like, nothing much happened. But, we just heard tonight about the fact that the real important change happened regarding the methane policy. And I think that's important. And I've read some others that said, well, this was the first time that anybody ever mentioned coal as something we needed to stop using. So it's important that we celebrate these successes. We're in for, the proverbial marathon and not the sprint. We're going to take us a long time to get through this, and don't let ourselves get discouraged, but celebrate the successes that we have. That's really important. And I want to do just a little bit of a digression to give you some celebrations that you could think about. The next slide, please. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell Wei-Tai. I'm sorry, Wei-Tai, to change the slides. Can you come to this slide on the picture? Yeah, you've got it. Good. This is a good news slide. Good news is important. We need to share good news every time you have a meeting with your volunteers and your team. This particular slide, it shows about what's happened with California's economy and its GHG emissions. The green line there is our gross domestic product in California, starting in 2000 over on the left-hand side and moving to 2017 when this slide was created. Our gross domestic product has gone up tremendously with a little dip there when the recession happened in 2009. And then population has increased too, continuing. But what's gone down are our greenhouse gas emissions, even though our population has increased. And the orange line shows greenhouse gas emissions per capita have continued to go down. And the bright yellow one shows the greenhouse emissions per GDP have gone down even more. So we are on a roll with our economy, and these are positive things that we're doing in our state. Why is this? In part because of the rules that were passed in California back in the 1970s, which you can see in the middle there with the next slide. Put us to the next one. Yeah, you can see the red line is California's per capita electricity use between 1963 and 2009. It's kind of started to flatline at about 1973-75. California passed Title 22 building energy efficiency rules. And we have per capita flatline. We're not increasing our electricity use. The rest of the country is the blue line going up. And if they would adopt our California rules, we'd be in much better shape nationwide. So that's another good news piece. The last one, I'll just show you real quick. Next slide, please, Wei-Tai. The next slide, if we could show it, yeah. Actually, go to two slides ahead.
Okay, this one?
Yeah, that's the one I want, yeah, sorry. This one, it shows basically that since 1990, the use of the use of energy efficient lighting has made it so that the energy usage in the whole United States per capita, residential electricity use has declined in 48 of our 50 states. You see the curve goes down. And that's because people are now using at first the CFL light bulbs and now to the LED light bulbs. And this energy efficient lighting takes up about 80% of all sales. So we're starting to see that people really are making a difference with these energy efficient light bulbs. It makes a difference here. And cities are shifting to LED street lights. And when doing so, San Jose saved 90% on their electricity bills for street lighting, which is an amazing amount by shifting over that. We'll skip the next couple of slides, yeah, if you would, yeah, and go to the one about accomplishing policy changes. Yeah, this one, good. So one thing that you need to do when you're thinking about policy changes, not just put them in place, but you need to implement them and you need to monitor them. And as citizen activists, that's often going to be our job. So we need to have countable goals. So be sure that your city does talk about a specific countable goal. And we've done some good work on this in some of the projects we've been doing as a volunteer nonprofit organization, the Fossil Free Silicon Valley Buildings Group. Diane showed you the numbers of people or cities that have been adopted. The REACH code adoptions is 24 or 25 Silicon Valley cities, and now up to 52 in California. I took this off the website, Diane, you got to update the numbers there off of your website. We also have an induction cooktop loaner program. We have about half a dozen single hob induction cooktops that people can use on their countertops in their kitchen just to try out the induction cooking process. And we've loaned them out to 70 people for 2-week loans during this past year. And we have more that we're getting out all the time. And now some of the city libraries have started induction cooktop loaner programs as well. We've also started a home ambassador program to have people who are volunteers serve as ambassadors to their neighbors. And they show what equipment they've purchased. They tell about the cost they paid, what rebates they got, the permits that were needed, the contractors they used. It's a person-to-person information changing system. And we've had 35 residents have agreed to be ambassadors to their neighbors and friends. And we matched them up with 26 people that have requested it. And now we're starting to go to open forums at city councils and talk about the ambassador program just to speak out loud to the council members and the audience. So we have an ambassador program, people that you can get involved with. So here we're counting what's going on. We're letting people see who are the volunteers who are involved, that they're making a difference, and we're trying to get the word out. But it's important to have the countable goals. Next slide, please. Another thing is really to encourage broad participation among your volunteers. And I mentioned that earlier. It's really important to have a cadre of people who regularly meet. They have a chance to have social interactions. That's one reason why people like to participate. I'm sure you all know that. And COVID has made it hard. Zoom meetings are not as much fun as in person, but we've managed to make it work. It's really important too to hold introductory sessions as you did this evening, just by explaining how the organization is set up and what you're trying to accomplish. That kind of intro for new people is really important to help new people get accustomed to what's going on. And it's important to avoid the jargons and stuff too that's really off-putting to people. They don't really understand what's going on. When I first started to work at the environmental movement back in, I guess, 1987 or so, I was working previously as an education activist because I was a PTA mom and I'd done that for a long time. And when someone would talk about what Bill said, I knew they meant Bill, the state superintendent of public instruction. So now I was going to these environmental meetings and they were talking about Felix. Who's Felix? What's this? Well, he was the guy who was the head of California Fish and Game. Oh, but then wait a minute, isn't there Fish and Wildlife? Oh, no, that's a federal organization. So I needed to learn what was going on. And as a new person, I was a staff person, I had to learn. But as a volunteer, I would have I don't know what's going on. People are talking about people I don't know. So you need to remember that when you've got new people there and you're trying to build a core of volunteers, to be sure you really bring them up. Don't use acronyms, spell things out. Be sure you talk about people's first and last names and where they fit into the scheme of things. It's so important. The other thing that's important is thinking about just talking about it. Create a buzz. Create positive stories about what's happening. When you want to inspire people, they need to think about what's the positive aspect of what's going on. As I mentioned, the induction cooktop program, loaner program we've had, we've been posting notices on the Nextdoor online community. And people sometimes say, I don't want to lose my gas stove. But the point being to start talking about the positive things, not to say, oh, we have to change because we're of climate change, but instead, you know that the induction cooktops are really wonderful. They don't cause any burns. You can turn them off right away. And they're very easy to clean. So you put out the positive aspects of what you're trying to change into. It's another way to build the positives instead of combating the negatives. Give me one more slide, Wei-Tai. Thank you. And then the last thing is to make your progress visible. When recycling first started, people would have to take their recyclables out to some place and change them out and give them away. But cities started to create city-based recycling programs and gave us the cans and boxes to put out on the sidewalk. And all of a sudden you'd look down the street on Tuesday morning, you'd see, oh, look at that. All the neighbors are doing this. They're putting out their recycling bins. I guess I should do that too. It builds a buzz. Similarly, the Prius car became the best-selling car in California because it kind of looked like this weird spaceship kind of shaped thing that nobody really, that's a different kind of car, but it sat in people's driveway and it sold much better than the Honda hybrid, which had a similar, gas saving ability, but the Honda hybrid just looked like any old sedan. It wasn't a visible symbol of the people's environmental concern that the Prius hybrid had. So try to make your situation visible. And that's hard when you're working on building inside your house because nobody knows what you're doing in the privacy of your boiler room. Are you changing your heater or not? So we're trying to have people use these new electrification yard signs that we've designed. And for homes that have changed their water heater or their cooking stove or their whole heater system, we're giving people a yard sign, and we've placed 91 of them now in our 2-county area. I think there's 2 or 3 over in the East Bay too. So it's a way to make it visible, the changes that you had. And the last idea along this line is just to do something like create a citywide thermometer. What's your goal on changing the heating systems in 50 houses and put out on a major corner a big sign that says, okay, our goal is 50 houses. Here's my thermometer. I'm starting at 15. The next month I'm going to be at 17. The next month I'll be at 18. And then I'm 23. Whatever kind of a thing you can measure and make it visible to people so they see that they're making a difference. It's really important. We're trying to get our city in Palo Alto to do a thermometer on City Hall that would show our progress towards our 80% reduction of GHGs by 2030. We'll see if we can get them to do it. Anyway, come up with ideas like that to make your progress visible, because working on buildings, it's hard to do, and that's a way to inspire people. So those are the thoughts that I had to share, and the last slide is just my address and connection, and we're glad to share any ideas or talk with people about what you're doing too. Thank you again for being such an audience.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Debbie, and to all of our speakers. I had the unenviable situation as the moderator here to try and decide whether to have the speakers continue to speak or cut them short so we can do some Q&A, and we're just about out of time here for Q&A. However, I think that all of our speakers had so much terrific information to share that the greatest value was to go ahead and have them share their full presentations so that we could all get the benefit of that. I hope everyone agrees with me on that. But let's start by giving them all a hand for this fantastic presentations. I made the comment about drinking from the fire hose, and I think for most of us, this whole series of presentations has been drinking from the fire hose. And I hope everyone feels that way. So we have only about 9 minutes to wrap up our meeting tonight. And I know Wei Tai and Matt may have some concluding comments. So what I'd like to recommend is that if you do have some follow-up comments, we're going to post the presentation, that perhaps you could reach out directly to the speakers tonight with any follow-up questions. We'll lose the value of everyone hearing everybody's questions, but I think we really need to kind of get to the wrap up on this. Is there just one or two just
Yeah, David, I think Matt and I are not going to have any. Let's dedicate the minutes that we have to some conversation, and we'll just
okay,
go right
great.
down the wire.
Great. Well, I've been
Let's take some
monitoring
questions.
the chat, and there weren't a lot of questions in there. There were several comments that I think people should take a look at. But one question was in there was, do you anticipate that supply chain issues are going to slow down electrification? Would any of our speakers like to respond to that?
Sure, I'll take that on. I think the short answer is yes in the short term and no in the long term. People are already complaining that induction stoves, for example, are on back order. That's true of some heat pumps as well. But I think we're experiencing supply chain issues like all across a lot of different sectors. It's something that direct install programs that I talked about can get around, because cities, counties, CCEs can do bulk purchasing to have the equipment on a truck ready to roll and ready to go. Yeah, so there are ways to kind of mitigate that.
Great, Diane. Thanks for addressing that. Are there other questions? I don't really see any hands up right now. It was a lot to consider. I'm wondering if, oh, there's one, Aaron Reven.
Hi, thank you for all these presentations. I just learned this morning at a City of Oakland electrification program that, unbeknownst to me, Oakland apparently doesn't even have an ordinance that requires even insulation or weatherization to be accomplished at point of sale or transfer of ownership. That blows my mind, because that's been in place for 30 years in Berkeley and probably other cities. So we are pretty far behind the 8 ball. And they've said that there was an attempt recently to pass that through City Council, and that there was a huge political battle with the real estate industry. I would love to know if anybody can just pull up any good journalism that covered that battle. And that seems to be a big hole in our armor that we ought to really plug.
Any of our speakers have a comment on that? Well, it's a really good point, Aaron. And you know what, one of the things, and I know Diane's really aware of this, and perhaps many people on the call today, is these requirements vary quite a bit from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And that's one of the points, as you know, it's almost like the early adopter theme. As more and more communities take these things on, that's a great talking point for activists like us to go to our jurisdictions and say, hey, they're doing this, and so are they, and so are they. We need to get on board. We're lagging behind. And that's something that politicians never like to have, is that their community, that their jurisdiction is lagging behind others. So thanks for bringing that. Elsa, I think you had your hand up next. Do you have a question?
I do. I think this is as important, if not more important, than Inconvenient Truth was a good number of years ago. And I wonder, Debbie and Diane, if the head of the EPA in Washington has ever seen this presentation from you, if you can get it to them. I just think it is such a powerful example, way beyond what I could have anticipated. And I even know you a little bit tonight. And it's such a powerful example for all cities. If it could get into all the mayor's conferences and all of that, it would just be incredible. And the advice for activists as well. And maybe Josh Becker can help get it a number of places, but I really think it's too important what you've developed, as well as the way you codify and synthesize the path to go along to be efficient. It's just fantastic. So how much further has it gone is my question.
Well, I think EPA would be nauseous over this question. There is so much greenwashing over gas nationally, and I don't think that national counterparts have sort of caught up to the need to eliminate gas from our homes and buildings. Methane gas from oil and gas, industrial production, yes. Agriculture, yes. From our homes and buildings, ooh, that's a hot button issue. And especially in Pennsylvania, where it's like fracking central. Yeah. I will say that it is very hard to convince other counterparts, state and national, about the value of mandates or standards. And most folks that I encounter prefer a voluntary approach. I didn't get into it that much, but my experience with voluntary approaches of this nature, they don't get that far. We don't move the needle. So our hope is, the theory of change is, if we can get enough cities to pass requirements that eliminate gas, that it could catch on to the state level. And once the state of California catches it, then it gets to be sort of contagious to other states.
And how much of it just around? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, just to that last point about the aggregate number of cities that are adopting these, if you look in the Bay Area, it's a huge number of people that are now under all electric ordinances. When you take City of San Francisco, City of San Jose, City of Oakland, just those three, you're talking millions and millions of people. So, you know, you can think of it just as the Bay Area, but it'll start spreading and affecting the whole market. Elsa, did you have a follow-up?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Thank you for letting me follow up. But you know, the slides on the outcomes, here's what we have saved. Here's how that relates to keeping, you know, lowering 1.5, that kind of thing. I just think in every area, or in most areas, you'll find one champion. And if that champion locally can know that this exists and then can help seed it in that area.
So here's the idea. We're all going to have access to this presentation. Let's us all be those people that spreads it out.
Yeah.
Bert, did you have a question? Bert Hill.
Yeah. I've been waiting months for PG&E to show up. I'm halfway through my electrification and they just don't come. And both, I've got two different contractors who are held up. One was my solar and the second is my hot water heater, and I have to double my service, and PG&E will not show up. They just, you know, it's really frustrating. It's like they're not interested.
Okay.
They can't go on.
Anyone have an idea on to help Bert out here?
That's one of those kind of things. PG&E is supposed to provide service to people. And you've probably documented by now the fact that you called them first, second, and third time, and they haven't come and they haven't come. And of course, they can say they're putting out fires or helping to repair transmission lines, but that's not really correct. I think it's time for you to send a letter to your city council and to your state assembly person, and also go onto the State Public Utilities Commission website and put in a complaint there, because they're supposed to be responding to people's needs. They're very unresponsive because they're not really much oversight over them, but those who start to put the pressure on, be the squeaky wheel.
As Paul knows, I did that with Senator Wiener yesterday in a Zoom call. I don't know if it's going to get me anywhere. I'm in San Francisco, but this is a situation that we've all got to address. Is that probably the biggest problem we're having is PG&E and doing a lot of our electrification planning.
Yeah.
All right.
David, how about one quick last question?
Yep. One last question.
60 seconds.
Yep. Mike Caggiano. Mike, are you there? There you go.
There we go. Yeah, we're rather similar to Bert's problem. We have a 33-unit building built in the 60s, and we're just trying to get some idea of what's needed to put in 33 charging stations, because everybody's got deeded parking, and I think we'd be willing to put in the plumbing for the, run the wires through the pipes and what have you, but we don't know where we stand as far as what capacity we have, how much additionally we would need. And I just could not get anywhere with PG&E as far as getting some idea of the parameters. You know, that we have to go hire an electrical engineer to get all this done, because I did speak with one, and I guess without some kind of payment, he wasn't going to give me a whole lot of information. But I think we're willing to do our part, but you need a little bit more cooperation. As far as I got a phone promise from PG&E that, oh, we're into business of selling electricity. If you need an extra heavy feeder run into your building, we'll do it free of charge. And I'm thinking, this sounds great on a phone call, but I just have yet to get anything in paper. And they sent me a huge survey on why I do it.
Yeah, I think Debbie's trying to get her hand up.
For you, Mike, there's a commercial company called PowerFlex. And they have consolidated with a number of other alternative energy providers, but go to PowerFlex, go to their services, go to the EV chargers place. Elsa's not the right person, but there's another woman I know who worked with them about 5 years ago to start to put EV chargers on all the schools in Los Altos. And they have a method of financing it that uses the PG&E rebates to actually do economies of scale. And at your situation, they might well be able to help you. And they've done a lot of Silicon Valley businesses. They've done schools, they've done nonprofits. Maybe get a commercial worker, they'll push on PG&E harder than you will because it's to their economic incentive to do it.
Okay, that's PowerFlex as it sounds. Power,
Yeah, .com. I was looking at their website the other day. They've done a number of the churches in Palo Alto area as well as the schools in Los Altos.
Thank you so much.
Give it a shot.
All right,
righty.
Ty.
Yes, fantastic. Look how, can we do a big round of applause for David, our moderator,
Oh,
Debbie,
yeah.
Diane, Jordan. Definitely tons of content here. Building electrification of existing buildings. We cannot boil the ocean in 90 minutes, though we tried. So we're going to have to continue in 2022. This was really our effort to pivot from new buildings, which you've done so successfully in the last 2 years, and really focus on another vein that's very, very promising. So please send me and Matt your ideas of speakers, and we'll continue this conversation throughout 2022, and let's go make some change next year. So with that, I will bid you all good night and thank you for joining us, and see you in the new year. All right.